So, apparently, the U.S. women's team has just won the World Cup. And there's some controversy because apparently they're sort of campaigning for better pay, for more equal pay for female athletes as opposed to male athletes because apparently the men's team gets paid better than the women's team does. And they point out that actually the women's team is doing a lot better than the men's team. The men's team usually doesn't make it to the finals or whatever in the World Cup, and the women's team has actually won the World Cup a couple of times. Um, I don't know personally. I don't know much about any of this about the sport itself because I don't watch soccer, to be honest with you. But anyway, so on the surface level, their argument makes sense that they should be getting as much or more money than the men's team since they're doing better. If you want to base it on performance, but when I did a little bit of research, did a little bit of googling to read what are the two sides of this debate because I had the intuition that there was probably more to it than just they're being jilted because they're women, and the only reason why I felt that intuition is because a lot of times when it comes down to these gender pay gap arguments, uh, frankly, I feel like there's a lot of disingenuous arguments that get trotted out as examples of women being discriminated against when it's not always down to women being discriminated against. Just uh, for example, when people point out, oh, women are getting paid 70 cents on the dollar, uh, that men are getting paid, they paint the image that women are getting paid 70 cents versus men getting paid a dollar to do the same exact job when in essence the disparity comes down to the different career paths on average that men and women take, and there's a variety of potential reasons for why that's the case, but I'm not going to get distracted too much by that. So this video is specifically about the women's uh, soccer team issue, which is an interesting example because in this case we are talking about the same exact job. They're both soccer players, and so that's why it interested me. And so when I look to see what the other side of the argument is, what the possible explanations for this besides sexism are, I found some reasonable explanations, which is basically it comes down to the contracts that the teams negotiated, which is that the women's team negotiated a base pay, a salary of I think like 100 grand or something like that, and the men's team negotiated not a salary but a performance based pay, and you get paid to play, and then you get performance based incentives, extra money for doing well, and so that comes down to why the men's team ends up getting more money than the women's team. Apparently, the women's team negotiated a contract that was more focused on security than on performance-based pay. And the possible, once again, the possible explanations for why this is, why they negotiated this different kind of contract, is that the women's soccer players don't make as much money uh, outside of the World Cup as the men's soccer players do, because the women's league in the United States and probably other places, but at least in the United States, the women's league doesn't have as big of a following as the men's league, and so there's not as much uh, revenue that's generated by women's soccer versus men's soccer, and this is pretty much the case in every sport. This is the case for the WNBA versus the NBA. This is the case for women's softball versus the MLB. I think that's the baseball league. Uh, you know, and there's a variety of potential reasons for why this might be the case. Um, People who are more into the whole feminism thing and arguing for equal rights for women and equal pay and all this stuff will usually tend to blame it on the sexist expectations of society, that we expect men to be athletes, we don't expect women to be athletes, and yada yada yada. But there's also just the fact that uh, the audience, it's largely a male driven audience. Men are more interested in sports on average than women. Men compete in sports more on average than women growing up in school and everything else. And it's sort of a male activity. Um, and obviously there's exceptions to this. I have cousins that are female athletes. I know there's plenty of women that are a lot more athletic than I am. I'm not that athletic at all, but I'm just saying, on average, in general, it's more of a male activity. And personally, I think when it comes down to why would I watch the NBA versus the WNBA, the reason is because it's more interesting to watch. I've watched both of them, and it's just better to me. The NBA, it's more impressive. It's more extreme, I guess, and it just is what it is. Not everybody is always going to be equally, like, think of it like this. If you had a white version of the NBA, that would be probably a lot less interesting to watch than the NBA as it stands, which is more of a black sport. Because on average, for whatever reason, black people are doing better at that sport. I mean, groups don't always get equally represented in every domain. And sometimes that comes down to characteristics of what makes the group interested in this activity. Sometimes it just comes down to innate characteristics that makes one group on average better than another group at this particular activity. I think with men and women, the disparity is obvious. I mean, there's a reason why we separate the sports in the first place. Otherwise, we would just integrate them and make the men and women compete against each other. So they point out, the women had better performance than the men's. Yes, in the women's league. If they had to play in the men's league, they probably wouldn't have done nearly as well. I don't know that for a fact, but that's just a guess. So no disrespect to them or anything. I'm not saying that they're not amazing at what they do, but their pay is based largely on what the market for their skill is. In other words, how much revenue can be generated based on their performance. It's not just down to how good they are at the sport, it's down to how many people want to watch them. Now, in the case of the World Cup, it's an interesting example because apparently the women's teams are drawing as big of a following as the men's team, and they're not getting as much promotion, and they don't get as good of accommodations and things like that. I think that should change. Where there's a market for it, they should be getting better representation because they are drawing a crowd. But when it comes down to their actual pay, once again, that's based on a contract that they specifically negotiated. And so I would just say that the onus is on them to next time negotiate a better contract. You can't cry foul after the fact, after you already negotiated a contract, and say, well, hey, but our performance was so good, how come we're not getting paid based on better performance? Well, you negotiated a contract that specifically doesn't pay you better based on better performance. The men's team did. They negotiated that kind of contract instead. So, based on the fact probably that you want to make sure that you get this certain amount of money regardless because you don't make as much money outside of the World Cup, that's understandable. But that's a choice that you made. That's an inevitable trade-off that you made, and there's not much that can be done about it other than the fact that the next time around, they should negotiate a better contract. They should say, listen, we've won with several World Cups. We bring a large following. We want to be compensated for it. And I guess that's sort of what they're doing by making all this noise about it. But, at the end of the day, when it's really going to matter is when they negotiate that contract. That's when they really need to drill home those arguments. And I think that they should get paid more if they're bringing in World Cups and they're making they have a big following. But once again, I don't rule this as they got jilted because they're women, because it's sexist, because this, that, and the third, which is the easy and the common narrative that a lot of people are putting forward because it gels with their ideology. I mean, at the end of the day, they negotiated that contract. That's the contract that they got. They agreed to it in advance, and they haven't been gypped at all because they've been compensated exactly the way that the contract that they negotiated said they would be compensated. That's all there is to it.